They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody warns you what happens when that blood turns cold. My name is Bertie Thompson, and for 63 years, I believed family meant everything. I believed it so deeply that I signed away my childhood home to my son Marcus without a second thought, thinking I was securing his future. What I didn't know was that I was signing away my dignity, my comfort, and eventually my place at the table I had set for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old Victorian house on Maple Street had been in my family since 1962. My late husband Jerome and I had painted every room, planted every rosebush, and replaced every creaky floorboard with our own hands. The wraparound porch where I used to shell peas and watch the neighborhood kids ride their bikes, the kitchen where I'd baked birthday cakes for 3 generations, the master bedroom where I'd rocked my babies to sleep during countless midnight feedings. Every corner held a memory, every wall a story. When Jerome passed 5 years ago, the house felt too quiet, too full of echoes. But it was still mine, still the place where I belonged. Marcus, my only child, had been struggling financially ever since his divorce from his first wife. His new girlfriend, Sasha, had expensive tastes, and even more Kensip dreams. They were living in a cramped apartment across town, arguing about rent, about space, about the future they couldn't quite afford. I remember the exact moment I made the decision. It was a Tuesday evening in March, and Marcus had come by for dinner looking defeated. His shoulders sagged under the weight of rejection letters from mortgage companies. His eyes held that particular exhaustion that comes from working 2 jobs and still falling short. Sasha sat beside him, perfectly manicured nails tapping against my grandmother's china, sighing dramatically every few minutes. "Mom," Marcus had said, pushing his meatloaf around his plate, "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. The rent keeps going up, and Sasha's been looking at wedding venues, but everything costs so much." Wedding venues. They'd been together 8 months, and she was already planning a wedding that would cost more than most people's annual salary. But I bit my tongue, the way mothers do when they want to keep peace with their children. "This house is way too big for just you, Bertie," Sasha had added, her voice carrying that particular tone that made suggestions sound like facts. "It's not practical. You're rattling around in here all alone, and we're cramped in that tiny apartment. It doesn't make sense." I looked around my dining room, at the family photos lining the mantel, at the hutch filled with wedding china and baby dishes and Christmas ornaments, collected over 4 decades of marriage, rattling around, as if my life, my memories, my very existence in this house was somehow wasteful. But Marcus looked so tired, so defeated, and I was his mother. Mothers fix things, mothers make sacrifices, mothers give until there's nothing left to give, and then they find a way to give more. "What if?" I heard myself saying, the words coming out before I could stop them. "What if I just signed the house over to you? You could take over the mortgage payments, and I could stay here with you. We could be a family again." The way Sasha's eyes lit up should have been my first warning. The way she immediately started talking about renovations, about updating the decor, about finally having space for entertaining, should have been my second. But I was looking at Marcus, at the relief flooding his face, at the way his shoulders straightened for the first time in months. "Mom, are you serious? You'd really do that?" Of course I was serious. I was his mother. I would have given him the moon if he'd asked for it. The paperwork was signed within 2 weeks. Marcus handled everything through his friend, who worked at a title company, explaining that it would be easier, faster, less expensive if we kept it simple. I signed my name on document after document, trusting completely, never thinking to read the fine print. Why would I? This was my son. This was family. They moved in on a Saturday in April. I watched from the kitchen window as Sasha directed the movers, pointing to my furniture and declaring it outdated, instructing them to put my belongings in the garage so she could start fresh. My grandmother's rocking chair, the one where I'd nursed Marcus as a baby, disappeared under a tarp. The family photos came down from the walls, replaced by abstract art, that looked like someone had spilled paint on canvas and called it inspiration. "Don't worry, Bertie," Sasha had said, not looking up from her phone as she scrolled through furniture websites. "We'll make this place beautiful, modern, Instagram worthy, as if the 43 years of love Jerome and I had poured into this house weren't beautiful enough." The changes started small. My morning routine of coffee on the front porch was interrupted by Sasha's yoga sessions, her mat spread across the entire space while she posed for photos. The kitchen, where I'd always done my cooking, became her domain. She replaced my well-seasoned cast iron with non-stick pans, my wooden spoons with silicone ones, my recipes with whatever she found on Pinterest that week. "I'm trying to eat cleaner," she'd explained when I offered to make my famous pot roast. "All that heavy food isn't good for anyone. I've been researching nutrition, and we really need to focus on whole foods, organic vegetables, lean proteins." My pot roast, the one Marcus had requested for every birthday since he was 7, was suddenly heavy food. The woman who'd never cooked anything more complicated than avocado toast was now the nutrition expert in my own kitchen, but I adapted. I always adapted. When she reorganized my spice cabinet according to color instead of alphabetical order, I learned the new system. When she moved my sewing machine to the basement because it cluttered the living room, I made do with the poor lighting and concrete floors. When she suggested I might be more comfortable eating my meals in the breakfast nook instead of the formal dining room because their friends found it awkward to have me hovering around, I took my plate and sat alone at the small table by the window, hovering. In the house where I'd hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties and anniversary celebrations, where I'd fed sick children and comforted heartbroken teenagers and welcomed new babies. Now I was hovering. The worst part wasn't the changes to it was watching my son disappear into someone else's vision of who he should be. Marcus had always been gentle, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered to call on Mother's Day and brought flowers for no reason. But under Sasha's influence, he became distant, distracted, always checking his phone for her approval before making any decision. "Marcus," I'd said one evening when she was out with her friends, "are you happy? Really happy?" He'd looked up from his laptop, eyes tired, and for a moment I saw my little boy again, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who used to say he'd marry me when he grew up because I was the nicest lady in the world. "I'm fine, Mom," he'd said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sasha just wants everything to be perfect, you know. She has big dreams for us, big dreams that apparently didn't include me." The final straw came on a Wednesday night in October. I'd been feeling under the weather, running a fever and dealing with a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. The autumn air was crisp, and I'd been looking forward to a quiet evening in the living room, maybe watching one of my old movies while sipping the honey tea that always helped soothe my throat. But when I came downstairs from my bedroom, I found the living room transformed. Sasha had invited her book club over, and the space was filled with women I didn't recognize, all perfectly dressed, all sipping wine from my good glasses, all speaking in the kind of loud performative voices people use when they want to sound important. I stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain. This was still my house, wasn't it? Even though I'd signed it over to Marcus, I still lived here. I still belonged here. "Oh, Bertie." Sasha's voice cut through the chatter, bright and sharp. "Perfect time. Could you possibly make us some of those little appetizers you do so well, and maybe refresh the wine? We're having such an important discussion about personal growth and empowerment." The way she said it, in front of all those women, made it clear that I wasn't being invited to join the discussion. I was being asked to serve it, in my own living room, to strangers drinking from my wedding china. I looked around for Marcus, hoping he might intervene, might say something, but he was nowhere to be found, probably upstairs in his room, avoiding the noise, avoiding the conflict, avoiding the choice between his mother and his girlfriend. "Of course," I heard myself saying, "because what else could I say? I'll just put something together." I spent the next hour in the kitchen, preparing cheese and crackers, cutting vegetables, arranging everything on the good serving platters, while listening to their laughter echo through the house. They were discussing some book about women reclaiming their power, about not letting anyone make them feel small, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story, about standing up for themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I brought the food out, setting it carefully on the coffee table, one of the women looked up at me with the kind of smile people give to service workers. "Oh, how lovely. You're so lucky, Sasha. Having live-in help. It's so hard to find good domestic assistants these days. Live-in help." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, holding an empty tray, wearing my old apron over my comfortable clothes, and I realized that was exactly what I looked like, what I'd become. Sasha laughed, a bright tinkling sound that cut through the air like glass. "Oh, Bertie's family. She's Marcus's mother, but she's been such a help around the house. I honestly don't know what we'd do without her. Family, but also help, mother, but also servant." The two weren't mutually exclusive in her mind, and apparently not in the minds of her friends, who all nodded knowingly and went back to their discussion about empowerment and self-worth. I retreated to the kitchen, my cheeks burning with humiliation. Through the doorway, I could hear them talking about the importance of boundaries, about not letting people take advantage of you, about knowing your worth, all while I stood washing their wine glasses and cleaning up their crumbs. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over. Live-in help. The phrase echoed in my mind like a curse. How had I gone from being the matriarch of this household to being the hired help? When had I stopped being Marcus's mother and started being Sasha's domestic assistant? The answer came to me slowly, painfully. It had happened gradually, one small compromise at a time. One moved piece of furniture, one changed meal plan, one request to help out that had somehow become an expectation. I'd been so focused on keeping the peace, on not making waves, on being the accommodating mother who never caused problems, that I'd forgotten to be a person with needs and feelings and rights. The next morning, I woke up early as always, and went downstairs to make coffee. But as I reached for the coffee maker, I found a note stuck to the refrigerator in Sasha's careful handwriting. "Bertie, Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if you moved into the garage apartment. It would give us all more space and privacy. We've already set up a bed and a mini fridge out there. Hope you understand. XO, Sasha." The garage apartment. The dusty, unfinished space above the garage where Jerome used to store his tools and I kept my Christmas decoration. The place where we'd talked about maybe creating a workshop someday, but never got around to it because we were too busy living our lives in the actual house. I read the note 3 times, each reading making the words more surreal. They wanted me to move to the garage, in my own house, the house I'd signed over to my son because I loved him, because I wanted to help him, because I thought we were family. I walked out to the garage, still in my robe and slippers, and climbed the narrow stairs to the space above. Someone had been busy. There was indeed a small bed, the kind of narrow twin mattress you'd find in a college dorm room. A mini fridge hummed in the corner, barely big enough to hold a carton of milk. A single lamp provided the only light beyond what filtered through the small window that looked out onto the alley behind the house. This was where they expected me to live. This was my new place in the family hierarchy. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the thin mattress barely cushioning my weight, and tried to process what was happening. How had I gotten here? How had the woman who'd owned this house, who'd raised her child in these rooms, who'd built a life within these walls, ended up being relegated to the space where we used to store lawnmowers and paint cans? The answer was simple and devastating. I had let it happen. Every time I'd said of course when I meant no, every time I'd smiled when I wanted to scream, every time I'd chosen peace over self-respect, I'd given away a piece of myself, and now there was nothing left to give except my dignity, and apparently, I'd already handed that over too. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and looked up to see Marcus's head appearing above the floor level. His face was flushed, his eyes avoiding mine. "Mom, I'm sorry about the note. Sasha should have talked to you first, but she was trying to help. She thought you'd be more comfortable with your own space, more comfortable, as if being exiled to the garage was a luxury upgrade, instead of the final humiliation in a series of degradations I'd somehow allowed myself to accept." "Marcus," I said, my voice steady, despite the trembling in my hands. This is my house. He winced, finally meeting my eyes. I know, Mom. I know it was your house, but legally, it's mine now. And Sasha and I were planning to get married, and we need our space. We need to start their own life, in my house, with me banished to the garage like an unwanted piece of furniture they couldn't quite bring themselves to throw away. I gave you this house, I said quietly, because I thought we were building something together. I thought I was helping my family. You were helping, he said quickly. You are helping. But things change, Mom. Relationships evolve. Sasha just thinks it would be better for everyone if we had some boundaries. Boundaries, that was the word his girlfriend used to justify everything, wasn't it? Her need to redecorate was about boundaries. Her insistence on controlling the kitchen was about boundaries. Her decision to exile me to the garage was about boundaries. But what about my boundaries? What about my right to feel comfortable in the house I'd lived in for 4 decades? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this person I'd sacrificed everything for, and I saw a stranger. When had he become someone who could stand in my garage and explain to me why I deserved to be here instead of in my own bedroom? When had he become someone who chose his girlfriend's comfort over his mother's dignity? I see, I said, because there was nothing else to say, nothing that would reach him, nothing that would make him remember who I was, who I'd been to him, who I'd always. He hovered at the top of the stairs for a moment, clearly wanting to say something else, maybe something that would make this seem less cruel, less final. But what could he say? What words could possibly justify this? I'll bring you some dinner later, he offered, as if food would somehow make living in the garage acceptable. Don't bother, I said. He left, and I sat alone in the space above the garage, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and dust, listening to the sounds of my own house through the thin walls. I could hear Sasha's voice, bright and cheerful, probably already planning how to use my bedroom, my closet, my bathroom. Maybe she'd turn it into a meditation room, or an office for her social media career, or a walk-in closet for all the clothes she bought with money that should have been going toward the mortgage. That night I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Every creak, every sigh of the old wood was familiar, a lullaby I'd been hearing for 43 years. But now I was hearing it from the outside, like a stranger, like someone who didn't belong. I thought about Jerome, about what he would say if he could see me now. He'd been a quiet man, gentle like Marcus, but he'd had a spine when it mattered. He never would have let anyone treat me this way, never would have stood by while I was pushed aside and forgotten. He'd loved this house too, but he'd loved me more. He'd have chosen me over the house, over the peace, over the path of least resistance. But Jerome was gone, and I was alone with a son who'd forgotten what I meant to him, and a woman who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. I pulled out my phone, the old flip phone that Sasha was always mocking, and scrolled through my contacts. There weren't many. Most of my friends had moved away, or passed on. My sister lived in Arizona with her own family. My neighbors were polite but distant. I'd spent so many years focused on taking care of Marcus, on being the perfect mother, that I'd forgotten to maintain the other relationships in my life. But there was one number I hadn't called in years, one person who might understand what I was going through, who might have advice or at least a sympathetic ear. My old friend Patricia had been through something similar with her daughter-in-law 5 years ago. We'd lost touch after she moved to the senior community across town, but I still had her number. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if she'd even remember me, wondering if I had the courage to admit how far I'd fallen. The next morning, I woke up with a crick in my neck from the cheap mattress, and the sound of voices below. Sasha was giving someone a tour of the house, her voice carrying clearly through the thin floor. And this is the garage, she was. We're thinking of converting it into a guest suite eventually, but for now, it's just storage. Storage. She was talking about my living space, about me, as if I were a piece of furniture they were warehousing until they figured out what to do with me. I got dressed quietly, trying not to make any noise that would remind them I was there, and crept down the stair. Through the window I could see Sasha with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them looking at the house with the kind of appreciation you'd expect from someone admiring a beautiful object they own. I slipped out the side door and walked around to the front of the house, to the porch where I'd spent so many peaceful mornings, but even that had been claimed. Sasha's yoga mat was spread across the entire space, along with her water bottle, her phone propped up to record her morning routine, her collection of crystals arranged just so for the perfect Instagram shot. I stood there for a moment, looking at my own front porch at the space where I'd shelled peas and read books, and watched the neighborhood children grow up, and I realized I was homeless. Not technically, not legally, but practically. I had nowhere to go in my own house. No space that was truly mine, no corner where I could exist without being in someone else's way. That's when I made the decision. Standing there on the front walk, looking at my house like a stranger, I realized that I had to make a choice. I could continue accepting this treatment, continue shrinking myself smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely, or I could remember who I was before I became the woman in the garage. I walked back to my car, the old Honda that Jerome and I had bought together 10 years ago, and drove downtown to the office of Patricia's son-in-law, the lawyer who'd helped her with her own situation. I'd remembered his name from the stories she used to tell, how he'd helped her understand her options, when her own family had started treating her like a burden instead of a person. David Morrison had kind eyes and a patient demeanor, the sort of person who specialized in helping people who'd forgotten they had rights. He listened to my story without judgment, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more serious as I described my living situation. "Mrs. Thompson," he said when I finished, "I need to ask you some questions about the property transfer. Do you have copies of the documents you signed?" I shook my head. "Marcus handled everything. He said it would be easier that way." David's expression tightened slightly. "Did you have independent legal representation when you signed the transfer?" "No," Marcus said, "we didn't need it. It was just family." "And did you receive any compensation for the property?" "No, it was a gift." I wanted to help him. David leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "Miss Thompson, I need to review the actual documents to be sure, but from what you're telling me, there may have been some irregularities in the transfer. Additionally, your current living situation raises some serious concerns about elder care and housing rights." Elder care. The phrase stung, but it also sparked something in me. I was elderly, wasn't I? At 63 with limited income, and nowhere else to go. I was vulnerable in ways I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "What are my options?" I asked. David spent the next hour explaining the various legal remedies available to me. I could contest the property transfer if there was evidence of undue influence or lack of proper representation. I could file a complaint about my living condition. I could explore elder abuse statutes that might apply to my situation. But the option that interested me most was the simplest one. "You could also just call the police," he said. "What you're describing, being forced to live in substandard conditions, without proper facilities, it's not legal. Regardless of who owns the house, you have rights as a tenant, and those rights include basic habitability standards." A tenant. I'd never thought of myself that way, but that's what I was, wasn't it? I was paying rent, in the form of household services, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the property. I was contributing to the household expenses. I had tenants' rights. What would happen if I called the police? I asked. They'd investigate the living conditions. If they found them substandard, they could require immediate remediation or order alternative housing. And if there's evidence of elder abuse or neglect, they'd be required to file a report with Adult Protective Services. Elder abuse. The words hung in the air between us. I'd never thought of what Marcus and Sasha were doing as abuse, but maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe I'd been so focused on making excuses for them, on finding ways to justify their treatment of me, that I'd missed the obvious truth. I left David's office with a business card, a list of my rights, and for the first time in months, a sense of purpose. I drove home slowly, thinking about everything he'd told me, weighing my options, preparing for what came next. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Marcus's car and Sasha's SUV, which meant they were both home. Perfect. It was time to have a conversation, a real conversation, about my place in this house and this family. I climbed the stairs to the garage apartment, but instead of going inside,
I sat down on the top step and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number David had given me, the direct line to the police department's community services division. I stared at the number for a long time, thinking about what would happen. Once I made this call, there would be no going back, no pretending that this was just a temporary arrangement, no more making excuses for behavior that had crossed the line from inconsiderate to abusive. But as I sat there, surrounded by the smell of motor oil and dust, listening to the sounds of my own house where I was no longer welcome, I realized that going back wasn't an option anyway. I'd already lost my home, my dignity, my relationship with my son. The only question was whether I'd lose myself too. I dialed the number, Community Services. This is Officer Jennifer Martinez. How can I help you? My name is Bertie Thompson, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I need to report a housing situation. I'm being forced to live in substandard conditions, and I think I need help.
As I gave Officer Martinez my address and began explaining my situation, I heard voices from the house below. Marcus and Sasha, probably wondering who was on the phone, probably annoyed that their storage unit was making noise. But for the first time in months, I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't their storage unit, their live-in help, their convenient grandmother figure who could be moved around like furniture. I was Bertie Thompson, and I was done being invisible. Officer Martinez told me she'd be there within the hour, and that I should document everything I could about my living conditions. I hung up the phone and looked around the garage apartment with new eyes, seeing it not as the accommodation I'd been forced to accept, but as evidence of how far I'd fallen, and how much I deserved better. I took pictures with my phone. The narrow bed, the mini fridge, the single lamp, the lack of proper bathroom facilities. I documented the dust, the poor ventilation, the oil stains on the concrete floor below. I made a list of all the household tasks I'd been performing, all the expenses I'd been covering, all the ways I'd been contributing to a household that treated me like a burden. When I heard the knock on the main house door, followed by voices, I knew Officer Martinez had arrived. I climbed down from the garage apartment and walked around to the front of the house, where I could see Marcus and Sasha talking to a woman in uniform. "Mrs. Thompson?" Officer Martinez called out when she saw me approaching. "That's me," I said, walking up the front steps to the porch that used to be mine. Marcus and Sasha were standing in the doorway, both looking confused and increasingly concerned as they realized I was the one who'd called the police. "Mom, what's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with worry and something else. "Anger, maybe, or fear. I called Officer Martinez because I need help with my living situation," I said calmly. "I've been forced to live in substandard conditions, and I wanted to know what my rights are." Sasha's face went pale. "Living conditions? Bertie, we set up a nice space for you in the garage. It has everything you need. Does it have a bathroom?" Officer Martinez asked. Sasha hesitated. "Well, no, but she has access to the house bathroom. Is it heated and properly ventilated?" Another hesitation. "It's not winter yet, so heating hasn't been an issue." Officer Martinez was taking notes. "And Mrs. Thompson, you're not paying rent, correct?" "I'm contributing to household expenses and performing domestic services in exchange for housing," I said, remembering the language David had used. "I cook, clean, maintain the property and contribute to utilities and groceries." Marcus was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Mom, you're making it sound like we're exploiting you. We're family. Family doesn't make each other live in garages," Officer Martinez said quietly. "Miss Thompson, would you mind showing me this living space?" I led her around to the garage, up the narrow stairs to the apartment. She spent several minutes taking notes, asking questions, documenting the condition. When we came back down, Marcus and Sasha were waiting, both looking increasingly agitated. "The living space doesn't meet basic habitability standards," Officer Martinez told them. "No bathroom facilities, inadequate climate control, potential safety hazards. Mrs. Thompson, you have several options here." She explained that I could file a formal complaint, that the city could require them to bring the space up to code, that there were resources available for seniors in housing disputes. But the option that caught my attention was the simplest one. You can also just refuse to live there, she said. You have the right to safe, adequate housing. If they can't provide that, they need to make other arrangements. I looked at Marcus, at the son I'd raised, at the man who'd been willing to watch me live in a garage, rather than stand up to his girlfriend. What other arrangements did he have in mind? A nursing home? The street? I understand, I said to Officer Martinez. Thank you for explaining my option. After she left, Marcus and Sasha stood on the front porch looking at me like I was a stranger. Maybe the woman who'd accepted the garage apartment, who'd smiled while being demoted from family member to household help, who'd swallowed her pride and her hurt for the sake of keeping peace. Maybe that woman was gone. Mom, I can't believe you called the police on us, Marcus said, his voice hurt and angry. We're trying to help you. We're trying to make this work. Make what work? I asked. Me living in the garage, me being your live-in mate, me disappearing so you and Sasha can play house in the home I gave you. Sasha stepped forward, her voice taking on that syrupy tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. Bertie, you're being dramatic. We've been nothing but accommodate. We've let you stay here. We've included you in family dinners. We've made sure you have everything you need. Let me stay. In my own house, the house I'd signed over to help them, thinking I was securing my place in their lives, not signing it away. Everything I need except respect, I said. Everything I need except a dignity. Everything I need except a place at the table I set for 40 years. I turned and walked toward my car, leaving them standing on the porch. I had calls to make, decisions to consider, a life to rebuild. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of them in my rearview mirror, still standing there, still trying to figure out what had just happened. They'd expected me to be grateful for the garage, grateful for the scraps of inclusion they'd thrown my way, grateful to exist on the margins of a life I'd spent decades building, but I wasn't grateful anymore. I was awake. The silence in my car felt different as I drove away from Maple Street. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the garage apartment, but something lighter, cleaner. The kind of silence that comes after you've finally said what needed saying, after you've stopped pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. I drove aimlessly at first, through neighborhoods I'd known for decades but somehow felt like I was seeing for the first time. Past the elementary school where Marcus had played on the swings, past the grocery store where I'd shopped every Thursday for 30 years, past the park where Jerome and I used to walk hand in hand when we were young and thought we had forever. Everything looked the same, but I felt fundamentally different, like I'd been wearing glasses with the wrong prescription for months, and had suddenly put on the right pair. The world was sharper now, clearer, and I could see things I'd been missing. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A text from Marcus. Mom, can we please talk about this like adults, as if I hadn't been the adult in this situation all along, the one making sacrifices, making accommodations, making excuses for behavior that never should have been tolerated. As if my decision to finally stand up for myself was somehow childish. I didn't respond. Not yet. I needed time to think, to process what had just happened, to figure out what came next, because one thing Officer Martinez had made clear was that I had options, real options. Not just the choice between accepting mistreatment and causing family drama, but actual legal, practical alternatives that didn't require me to sacrifice my dignity. I found myself pulling into the parking lot of Miller's Diner, the place Jerome and I used to go for breakfast every Sunday after church. The same red vinyl booths, the same black and white checkered floor, the same smell of coffee and bacon that had welcomed us for 15 years of Sunday mornings. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes and tired smile, led me to a booth by the window. I ordered coffee and pie, not because I was particularly hungry, but because I needed to sit somewhere that felt normal, somewhere that remembered who I used to be before I became the woman in the garage. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sasha. Bertie, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Marcus and I were just trying to give everyone more space. We never meant to make you feel unwelcome. Can we please discuss this calmly? More space? Give everyone more space. by cramming me into a garage with no bathroom and a mini fridge. The mental gymnastics required to frame my exile as a generous gesture was almost impressive in its audacity. I sipped my coffee and watched the late afternoon traffic through the window. Regular people going about their regular lives, probably heading home to houses where they belonged, where they had a place at the table, where their children saw them as human beings worthy of basic respect. When had I stopped expecting that for myself? When had I decided that wanting to be treated with dignity was asking too much? The answer came to me slowly, uncomfortably. It had started with small compromises, little ways of keeping peace. When Jerome died and I was rattling around in that big house alone, I'd felt guilty for taking up so much space. When Marcus struggled financially, I'd felt guilty for having something he needed. When Sasha wanted to redecorate, I'd felt guilty for being attached to old furniture and outdated styles. Guilt had been the first domino to fall, and everything else had followed. Guilt had made me grateful for scraps, grateful for inclusion on their terms, grateful to exist on the margins of a life I'd built with my own hands. But sitting in that diner, watching normal people live normal lives, I remembered something I'd forgotten. I wasn't a bird, I wasn't an inconvenience. I was a woman who'd worked 2 jobs to support her child, who'd built a home and a life and a legacy. I was someone who deserved better than a garage apartment, and the privilege of cooking for people who couldn't be bothered to save me a seat at dinner. My phone rang. Marcus. I stared at his name on the screen, remembering the little boy who used to call me his best friend, who used to say he wanted to take care of me when I got old. Apparently his version of taking care of me involved a narrow bed above the garage. I let it go to voicemail. The waitress refilled my coffee and asked if I needed anything else. Her name tag said, Jenny, and she had the sort of face that had seen its share of troubles, but hadn't let them steal her kindness. You look like you've got something weighing on your mind, she said gently. I almost brushed off her concern with a polite smile and a change of subject, the way I'd been trained to do. Don't burden others with your problems, don't make waves, don't take up too much space with your feelings. But something about her genuine concern, about sitting in this place that held so many good memories, made me want to be honest. I'm having some family troubles, I said. My son and his girlfriend have been treating me badly, and I finally stood up for myself today. Now I'm not sure what happens next. Jenny nodded like she'd heard this story before. Good for you, for standing up. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Finally saying enough is enough. I'm scared I've ruined everything, I admitted. My relationship with my son, my place in the family, everything. Honey, Jenny said, sitting down across from me for a moment. If standing up for yourself ruins a relationship, then it wasn't much of a relationship to begin with. Real love doesn't require you to make yourself small. Real love doesn't require you to make yourself small. The words hit me like a revelation. I'd been making myself smaller and smaller for months, shrinking to fit into whatever space they were willing to give me, and I'd called it love, I'd called it family, I'd called it sacrifice, but it wasn't any of those things. It was fear. Fear of being alone, fear of losing Marcus, fear of admitting that the son I'd raised had grown into someone who could watch me live in a garage without losing sleep over it. Jenny had to get back to work, but her words stayed with me as I finished my coffee and tried to figure out what to do next. I couldn't go back to the garage apartment, not after today, not after calling the police, not after finally speaking the truth about what had been happening to me. But I also couldn't afford a hotel indefinitely, and I didn't have many friends left to turn to. I'd let most of my relationships slide over the years, too focused on Marcus and his needs, too busy being the perfect mother to maintain the other connections that might have sustained me now. That's when I remembered Patricia, my old friend who'd been through something similar with her own daughter-in-law, Patricia, who'd eventually moved to Sunset Manor, the senior community across town. Patricia, who might understand what I was going through better than anyone else. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her number. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. It had been 3 years since we'd spoken, maybe longer. Would she even remember me? Would she want to hear from someone who'd basically disappeared from her life when things got complicated? But what was the worst that could happen? She could hang up, could tell me she was too busy, could remind me that I'd been a terrible friend who only called when I needed something. All of those things would hurt, but they couldn't hurt worse than spending another night in that garage, pretending that my exile was acceptable because it kept the peace. I dialed her number, Bertie Thompson. Patricia's voice was warm, surprised, delighted. My goodness, how long has it been? How are you, honey? The relief in hearing her voice, in being remembered with affection instead of obligation, almost brought me to tears. I started, then stopped. How was I? I'm having a difficult time, Patricia. I was wondering if we could talk. Of course we can talk. Are you all right? You sound upset. I gave her the short version, sitting in my car in the diner parking lot, as the sun set around me. The house I'd signed over to Marcus, the gradual erosion of my place in the family, the garage apartment, the police call, all of it spilling out in a rush of words I'd been holding back for months. Patricia listened without interrupting, making soft sounds of sympathy and understanding. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. "Oh, Bertie," she said finally, "I'm so sorry, and I'm so proud of you for calling the police. That took real courage. I don't feel courageous. I feel terrified. I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight." "You're going to sleep here," Patricia said without hesitation, "in my guest room. And tomorrow we're going to figure out your next steps." The kindness in her voice, the immediate offer of help without questions or conditions, broke something open in my chest. This was what family should feel like. This was what love looked like when it wasn't tangled up in manipulation and guilt. "Patricia, I can't impose on you like that. We haven't even spoken in years. Exactly why we have so much catching up to do," she said firmly. "I'm at Sunset Manor, Unit 47B. Do you remember how to get here?" I did remember. I'd visited once when she first moved in, back when I still had a social life, back when I still made time for friendships that weren't filtered through Marcus and his needs. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Bertie Thompson, if you don't get yourself over here in the next hour, I'm going to drive over there and collect you myself. And at my age, that's a threat to public safety." Despite everything, I laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. I drove to Sunset Manor as the last light faded from the sky. The senior community was nicer than I remembered. Well-maintained buildings surrounded by gardens and walking paths. People were out enjoying the evening air, sitting on porches, walking small dogs, living lives that looked peaceful and purposeful. Patricia met me at her door before I even had a chance to knock. She looked older than I remembered, but her smile was the same, and her hug was exactly what I needed. Warm, genuine, uncomplicated by expectations or resentment. "Look at you," she said, holding me at arm's length, "still beautiful but tired. Come in, come in. I've got coffee brewing and leftover lasagna that's much better than anything I used to make when we were younger." Her apartment was small but lovely, decorated with photos and plants, and the kind of comfortable furniture that invited you to stay a while. It felt like a home, like a place where someone lived fully and happily, not like a storage unit where unwanted family members were warehoused. We sat at her kitchen table eating lasagna and drinking coffee, and I told her the whole story, every detail, every humiliation, every moment when I'd chosen silence over self-respect. Patricia listened, nodding occasionally, her face growing more and more angry on my behalf. "That little witch," she said, when I described Sasha's book club comment about live-in help, "and Marcus just sat there and let it happen. He wasn't even in the room," I said. "He's been avoiding conflict by avoiding me altogether." "Coward," Patricia said bluntly, "just like my son-in-law was. They'd rather sacrifice their mothers than stand up to their wives." Patricia's situation had been different but similar. Her daughter-in-law had wanted her to move to a nursing home, claiming it was for her own safety. Patricia had fought back, gotten legal help, and eventually chosen to move to Sunset Manor on her own terms, rather than be pushed into institutional care. "The thing is," Patricia said, "once you stop accepting unacceptable treatment, everything changes. Not just how they treat you, but how you see yourself, how you see what you deserve." "I'm scared," I admitted. "What if Marcus never speaks to me again? What if I've lost him forever?" Patricia reached across the table and took my hand. "Honey, you can't lose something you never really had. The Marcus you're mourning,
The one who would never let anyone treat you this way. He's been gone for a while now. Maybe it's time to stop grieving for him and start living for yourself. The truth of it settled in my chest like a stone, heavy, but solid, real. We talked until late, sharing stories and memories, catching up on the years we'd lost. Patricia told me about her life at Sunset Manor, about the friends she'd made, the activities she enjoyed, the independence she'd reclaimed after years of feeling like a burden to her family. The best part, she said, is that everyone here chose to be here. No one's living in someone else's garage, eating someone else's scraps, grateful for whatever attention they can get. We're all here because we decided we deserved better. Deserved better. Such a simple concept, but it felt revolutionary after months of accepting less and calling it family loyalty. That night, I slept in Patricia's guest room on sheets that smelled like lavender and sunshine. The bed was comfortable, the room was warm, and for the first time in months I felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Protected from people who saw my kindness as weakness, my love as an unlimited resource to be exploited without consequence. My phone buzzed with messages throughout the evening. Marcus, Sasha, even a few numbers I didn't recognize. Friends of theirs, maybe, or relatives who'd heard some version of the story and wanted to add their opinions to the mix. I turned the phone off without reading any of them. Tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with whatever consequences my moment of courage had unleashed. Tonight, I just wanted to remember what it felt like to be somewhere I was wanted, somewhere I belonged. When I woke up the next morning, Patricia was already up, making coffee and scrambling eggs in her sunny kitchen. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway, still in my pajamas, hair a mess from the best night's sleep I'd had in months. "Good morning, sunshine," she said. "How did you sleep?" "Like a human being," I said, and we both laughed. Over breakfast, Patricia laid out a plan. First, I needed to get my belongings from the garage apartment. Not everything, not the furniture they'd moved out there, but my personal items, my clothes, the few things that were truly mine. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "I'll come with you, and we'll bring backup." Turned out to be Patricia's friend Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who'd been a social worker before retirement, and Eleanor's son Michael, who happened to be a police officer in the county sheriff's department. "We're not going to cause trouble," Patricia explained as we drove toward Maple Street in Michael's personal car. "We're just going to make sure you can collect your things in peace, without harassment or drama." The sight of my house, the Victorian that had been my sanctuary for 4 decades, hit me harder than I'd expected. It looked the same from the outside, but I felt like a stranger approaching it, like someone who'd once lived there long ago but no longer belonged. Marcus's car was in the driveway, along with Sasha's SUV. They were both home, probably waiting for me to come crawling back, ready to apologize for causing trouble and accept whatever terms they offered for my return. They were going to be disappointed. I knocked on the front door, Patricia and Eleanor flanking me, while Michael waited by the car in case his official presence became necessary. Marcus opened the door, his face cycling through surprise, relief, and something that might have been hope. "Mom, thank God, we've been so worried. Come in, let's talk about this." "I'm here to collect my personal belongings from the garage," I said calmly. "These are my friends, and they're here to help me." His face fell. "Mom, you don't need to do this. We can work things out." Sasha feels terrible about the misunderstanding.
Misunderstanding, as if exiling me to the garage had been some sort of communication error, rather than a deliberate decision to push me out of the way. "Where is Sasha?" I asked. "She's inside. She wants to apologize, to explain." "That's not necessary," I said. "I just need to get my things." Marcus looked past me to Patricia and Eleanor, clearly trying to figure out who they were and what they represented. "Mom, can we please talk privately, without an audience?" "I've been talking privately with you for months," I said. "It hasn't been working out very well for me." Sasha appeared behind Marcus, her face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Bertie, I'm so glad you're okay. We were worried sick when you didn't come home last night." "Come home?" "To the garage, to the space above where they parked their cars, where I was expected to be grateful for a mini fridge and a narrow bed. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm here to collect my belongings." "Of course," Sasha said quickly, "but maybe we could talk first. I think there's been a real misunderstanding about our intentions." Eleanor stepped forward, her social worker training evident in her calm professional demeanor. "Mrs. Thompson is here to collect her personal property. Are you going to allow her access, or do we need to involve law enforcement?" The mention of law enforcement made both Marcus and Sasha stiffen. They stepped aside, and I walked through my own front door, feeling like an intruder. The house looked different, not just redecorated, but stripped of everything that had made it mine. The family photos were gone, replaced by abstract art that looked like it came from a hotel lobby. My grandmother's doilies had been removed from the side table. Even the smell was different, all traces of the meals I'd cooked and the life I'd lived, scrubbed away and replaced with something artificial and cold. I walked through the rooms I'd known by heart, seeing them with new eyes. This wasn't my house anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was their house, decorated to their taste, arranged for their comfort, designed for their life together. And there was no place in it for me. Not really. Not as anything more than a convenient servant who could be moved around as needed, housed wherever was least inconvenient for them. The garage apartment looked even worse than I remembered. In the harsh light of morning, with Patricia and Eleanor beside me for perspective, I could see how truly inadequate it was. The dust, the poor ventilation, the complete lack of privacy or comfort, the mini fridge that barely worked, the bed that was more like a cot, the single lamp that provided the only light beyond what filtered through the grimy window. "Good Lord," Eleanor breathed. "They actually expected you to live here." I gathered my clothes, my personal items, the few photographs I'd managed to keep. It didn't take long. I hadn't been allowed to bring much with me when I'd been exiled from the main house. As we loaded my belongings into Michael's car, Marcus appeared at the garage. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed like he hadn't slept. "Mom, please, don't do this. Don't leave like this." I stopped and looked at him. Really looked at him. This man I'd raised, this person I'd loved more than my own life, this stranger who'd watched me live in a garage and called it family. "I'm not leaving, Marcus," I said quietly. "I already left, months ago when you decided your girlfriend's comfort was more important than your mother's dignity. I just finally stopped pretending I still had a place here." He flinched like I'd slapped him. "That's not fair. We were trying to make it work for everyone." "You were trying to make it work for you and Sasha," I corrected. "I was just supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps you threw my way." Sasha appeared beside him, her face flushed with anger or embarrassment. "Bertie, you're being completely unreasonable. We offered you a place to stay when you had nowhere else to go." The audacity of it took my breath away. "I had somewhere to go," I said. "I had my own house, the house I signed over to help you, thinking I was securing my place in your family. Instead, I secured my exile to the garage." "We never asked you to sign the house over," Sasha said, her voice rising. "That was your choice." Patricia stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Young lady, you might want to think very carefully about what you say next, because there are laws about elder abuse, and what you've been doing to this woman comes very close to qualifying." The color drained from Sasha's face. Marcus put a protective arm around her, and I saw it clearly for the first time. His choice, his loyalty, his priority. Not me. Never. "Good luck," I said, getting into Michael's car. "You're going to need it." As we drove away, I watched my house disappear in the side mirror. The Victorian on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch and rose bushes, with its memories and its ghosts. It was beautiful, but it wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it never really had been. Maybe it had always belonged to whoever was willing to fight for it, and I'd forgotten how to fight. But I was remembering now. Back at Patricia's apartment, we sorted through my belongings and made plans. I had some money in savings, enough to rent a small apartment if I was careful. I had my social security, a small pension from my years working at the school district. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't destitute either. More importantly, I had something I'd lost and was just beginning to reclaim: my sense of worth, my understanding that I deserved better than a garage apartment, and the privilege of cooking for people who couldn't be bothered to include me in the conversation. My phone had been buzzing all day with calls and texts from Marcus, from Sasha, from numbers I didn't recognize. I finally turned it on and scrolled through the messages. Marcus. Mom, please call me. We need to talk. Sasha. I'm sorry if you felt unwelcome. That was never our intention. Unknown number. This is Ashley, Marcus's cousin. I heard what happened and I'm so sorry. You deserve better. Unknown number. Bertie. This is Tom from next door. If you need anything, please let us know. We always thought you were too good for how they were treating you. The neighbors had noticed. Marcus's own relatives had opinions about how I was being treated. I hadn't been imagining it, hadn't been overreacting. Other people had seen what I'd been too close to recognize, that I was being abused, neglected, pushed aside by people who were supposed to love me. I turned the phone off again. I wasn't ready to respond, wasn't ready to engage with their attempts to minimize what had happened, or their offers of conditional reconciliation. That evening, Patricia and I sat on her small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was cool, autumn settling in, and I found myself thinking about all the seasons I'd watched change from the windows of the house on Maple Street. Do you miss it? Patricia asked. The house? I considered the question serious. Did I miss the house itself? Or did I miss the life I'd built there? Did I miss the rooms and the furniture? Or did I miss feeling like I belonged somewhere? I miss the woman I used to be there, I said finally, before I forgot that I mattered too. Patricia nodded. The good news is, that woman is still there. She just needed reminding. Over the next few days, with Patricia's help and encouragement, I started building a new life. I looked at apartments, small but comfortable places where I could start over. I visited senior centers, explored activities and social groups, began to remember what it felt like to be around people who saw me as a person rather than a problem to be managed. I also made an appointment with David Morrison, the lawyer Patricia had recommended. He reviewed the documents from the property transfer, and his expression grew more serious as he read. Mrs. Thompson, he said finally, I'm concerned about how this transfer was handled. You had no independent legal representation. No consideration was given for the property, and the circumstances suggest possible undue influence. What does that mean? I asked. It means you may have grounds to challenge the transfer, to get your house back. The possibility hung in the air between us like a bridge. I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. Did I want the house back? Did I want to fight Marcus in court? To air our family's dirty laundry in public? To risk whatever relationship we might still salvage? Or did I want to move forward, to build something new, to stop looking backward at what I'd lost, and start looking forward at what I might gain? It was a question I'd have to answer soon, but for now it was enough to know that I had options, real options, legal options. For the first time in months, I felt like I had power in my own life, not the power to control other people, or force them to love me the way I wanted to be loved, but the power to choose what I would and wouldn't accept, the power to walk away from situations that diminished, the power to build a life where I was valued, respected, seen. My phone rang. Marcus again. This time, I answered. Hello, Marcus. Mom, thank God. Are you okay? Where are you staying? I'm staying with friends, I said. I'm fine. Good, good. That's good. Mom, I think we need to talk, really talk, about everything. I leaned back in Patricia's comfortable chair, looking out at the garden where other seniors were tending their small plots, growing things, nurturing life. I think you're right, I said. We do need to talk, but not yet. I'm not ready yet. When? He asked, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. When will you be ready? When I figure out who I am, when I'm not trying to be the mother you want me to be, I said. When I remember what I deserve and what I'm willing to accept. There was silence on the other end of the line. I love you, Marcus, I said, but I love myself too, and I'm just learning how to balance those two things. I hung up before he could respond, before he could try to negotiate, or explain, or minimize, before I could be tempted to make it easier for him, to absorb his discomfort, to sacrifice my peace for his convenience. The sun was setting over Sunset Manor, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purple. Around me, People were living full lives, making their own choices, refusing to be diminished by age or circumstance, or other people's expectations. For the first time in my life, I was one of them, and it felt like coming home. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in my own apartment for the first time in almost a year. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit, in a modest complex called Willowbrook Gardens, but every stick of furniture belonged to me. Every picture on the wall was there because I wanted it there. Every cup in the cupboard was mine to use without asking permission or worrying about whether I was being too presumptuous. The apartment hunt had been an adventure I hadn't expected to enjoy. Patricia had insisted on coming with me to every showing, armed with a list of questions I never would have thought to ask about water pressure and heating costs, and neighborhood safety. She'd also brought Eleanor along to most of them, claiming we needed a third opinion, but I suspected she just wanted me to have as much support as possible during what could have been a demoralizing process. Instead, it had been liberating. Walking through different spaces, imagining how I might arrange my limited belongings, thinking about what kind of life I wanted to build rather than what kind of life I was expected to fit into. For months, I'd been shrinking to accommodate other people's needs. Now I was expanding again, remembering that I had preferences, opinions, desires of my own. The apartment I chose was on the second floor of a well-maintained building with a small balcony that caught the morning sun. There was a community garden in the back where residents could rent small plots, and a library just 2 blocks away. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors seemed friendly, and most importantly, it felt like a place where I could breathe. Moving day had been both melancholy and exhilarating. My worldly possessions fit into Patricia's car and Eleanor's minivan, with room to spare. Decades of accumulation reduced to a few boxes of clothes, some books, my mother's china, and the photographs that had survived Sasha's redecorating purge. It should have been depressing, but instead, it felt like freedom. No excess, no clutter, no reminders of a life that had been slowly dismantled piece by piece. My new neighbors had been welcoming in a way that surprised me. Missing from across the hall had brought me homemade dumplings and a spider plant cutting. The young couple downstairs had offered to help if I needed anything heavy moved. Even the building manager, a woman named Rita with kind eyes and efficient hands, had gone out of her way to make sure I felt comfortable and settled. It occurred to me that I'd forgotten what normal human kindness looked like. After months of walking on eggshells, of being grateful for basic courtesy, of accepting crumbs and calling them cake, simple neighborly gestures felt almost overwhelming in their generosity. I'd been living in my new place for 2 weeks when David Morrison called with an update on the legal situation. His tone was more optimistic than I'd expected, which both thrilled and terrified me. "I've reviewed all the documents," he said, "and I believe we have a strong case for challenging the property transfer. The lack of independent counsel, the absence of any consideration, the pressure tactics used to convince you to sign, all of it adds up to what the courts would likely consider undue influence." I sat at my small kitchen table, looking out at the community garden where an elderly man was carefully tending his tomato plants, and tried to process what David was telling me. "What would that mean exactly?" I asked. If we were successful, the transfer would be declared invalid, and ownership of the property would revert to you. Your son and his girlfriend would have to vacate the premises." The thought of Marcus and Sasha being forced to leave the house should have filled me with satisfaction, but instead, it left me feeling empty, sad. Even after everything they'd done, the idea of making them homeless felt wrong. But then I remembered the garage apartment, the mini fridge, the humiliation of being treated like a servant in my own home, and the sadness hardened into something more resolute. "What are the chances we'd win?" I asked. "Better than 60%, I'd say. Maybe 70 if your son and his girlfriend can't provide compelling evidence that the transfer was truly voluntary and in your best interest." I thanked David and told him I'd think about it, but even as I hung up the phone, I knew what I was going to do. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to hurt Marcus, but because I was tired of being the only person in this situation who was expected to sacrifice for the greater good. For months, I'd been the one making accommodation. I'd been the one swallowing my pride, accepting less, making do with inadequate arrangements so that everyone else could be comfortable. I'd been the one expected to understand, to forgive, to move on without ever receiving an apology or acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. Well, I was done being understanding. I was done making it easy for people who'd shown no consideration for my comfort or dignity. If Marcus wanted to keep the house, he could fight for it the same way I'd had to fight for basic human respect. My phone had been ringing regularly since I'd left Maple Street. Marcus called at least twice a day, sometimes more. Sasha had sent a series of increasingly frantic text messages that started with gentle attempts at reconciliation and escalated to accusations that I was being selfish and cruel. Other relatives had begun weighing in, some supportive, others clearly getting only one side of the story and urging me to work things out for the sake of family unity. I'd stopped answering most of the calls and messages, not out of spite but out of self-preservation. Every conversation seemed designed to pull me back into the role of the accommodating mother who put everyone else's needs before her own. Every well-meaning relative who suggested I be the bigger person was essentially asking me to accept mistreatment for the sake of keeping peace. But one call I did take was from Marcus's cousin Ashley, the one who'd sent the supportive text when everything first exploded. We'd always gotten along well, and she'd been one of the few family members who'd never made me feel like I was taking up too much space or asking for too much attention. "Aunt Bertie," she said when I answered, "I just wanted you to know that not everyone in this family thinks you're wrong. What Marcus and Sasha did to you was awful, and you have every right to be angry." The validation was like cool water on a burn I hadn't realized was still hurt. For weeks, I'd been questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, if my expectations were unreasonable, if I was being too sensitive about what others might consider minor slights. "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than she could know. "I wanted to tell you something else," Ashley continued, "about the house situation. I don't know if Marcus told you, but Sasha's been posting about it on social media, making herself out to be the victim, saying you abandoned them and left them with a mortgage they can't afford." My stomach clenched. What kind of posts? The usual passive-aggressive stuff, quotes about family loyalty and forgiveness, pictures of the house with captions about how hard they're working to make their dream home perfect, subtle digs about how some people can't handle change or compromise. I closed my eyes, imagining my private family drama being broadcast to Sasha's followers, reframed as a story where she and Marcus were the wronged parties struggling to overcome my unreasonable behavior. "There's more," Ashley said gently. "She's been hinting that you might not be mentally competent anymore, talking about how hard it is when elderly family members become confused or hostile, how sometimes adult children have to make difficult decisions for everyone's safety." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not mentally competent, confused, hostile. Sasha was laying the groundwork to paint me as an unstable elderly woman, whose actions couldn't be trusted, whose decisions weren't valid, whose complaints weren't credible. It was a brilliant strategy, actually. If anyone questioned why they'd made me live in the garage, they could point to my supposed mental decline. If anyone wondered why they hadn't included me in family activities, they could cite my alleged hostility. If the legal challenge to the property transfer gained traction, they could argue that I hadn't been competent to sign the documents in the first place. "Ashley, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to document those posts. Screenshot them, save them, whatever you have to do." "Can you do that for me?" "Already done," she said. "I started saving them as soon as I saw what she was doing. I figured you might need them someday." After I hung up with Ashley, I sat in my quiet apartment, trying to process this new development. Sasha wasn't just defending herself, she was going on the offensive, trying to control the narrative before I could tell my side of the story. She was positioning herself as the long-suffering caregiver dealing with a difficult elderly relative, rather than the woman who'd systematically pushed me out of my own home. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity, but it was also strategic. If she could convince people that I was mentally unstable, it would undermine everything I said about how I'd been treated. It would make my exile to the garage seem like a necessary precaution rather than elder abuse. It would make their failure to include me in family life seem like protection rather than neglect. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd done it all in writing, on social media, where it could be documented and used against her. I called David Morrison and told him about Sasha's posts, about her attempts to paint me as mentally incompetent. His response was immediate and decisive. We need to act quickly, he said. If she's building a case for your mental incompetence, we can't let that narrative take root. I'm going to file the challenge to the property transfer this week, and I'm going to request a competency evaluation to demonstrate that you're fully capable of making your own decisions. A competency evaluation. The phrase made me feel like I was already losing ground, already having to prove something that should have been assumed, but I understood the necessity. Better to address the question head-on than to let Sasha's insinuations fester unchallenged. The evaluation was scheduled for the following week, conducted by a court-appointed psychologist named Dr. Sarah Chen. She was professional but warm, asking detailed questions about my life, my health, my decision-making process. We talked about the property transfer, about my reasons for leaving the house, about my current living situation, and future plans. Miss Thompson, she said at the end of our session, I want you to know that nothing you've told me suggests any cognitive impairment or inability to make rational decisions. You're clearly processing complex emotional and legal situations with appropriate judgment and self-awareness. The relief was overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much Sasha's campaign of character assassination had affected me until I heard an objective professional confirm that I wasn't confused, wasn't incompetent, wasn't the problem in this situation. What happens next? I asked. I'll submit my report to the court, and it will become part of the record in your case. If anyone tries to question your mental capacity, this evaluation will serve as evidence that you're fully competent to make your own decisions about your property and your life. Armed with Dr. Chen's report, David filed the legal challenge to the property transfer. The papers were served on Marcus and Sasha on a Tuesday morning while I was volunteering at the community garden, helping other residents plant fall vegetables and prepare for winter. I was kneeling in the dirt, showing Miss Chen's granddaughter how to plant garlic cloves, when my phone rang. Marcus, I almost didn't answer, but something about the timing made me think this might be important. Mom, what the hell is this? His voice was shaking, whether from anger or fear I couldn't tell. You're suing us. You're trying to take our house? Our house. Even now. Even after everything, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that it had been my house first, that I'd given it to him as a gift, that his ownership was entirely dependent on my generosity. I'm challenging the property transfer, I said calmly, continuing to help the little girl with her planting. My lawyer believes it was conducted improperly. This is insane. You signed those papers willingly. No one forced you. Did I have independent legal representation when I signed them? Silence. Did anyone explain my rights to me, or the implications of the transfer? More silence. Did you or Sasha ever discuss with me what would happen if living together didn't work out? Mom, you're our family. We never thought it wouldn't work out. But it didn't work out, did it? And when it didn't, instead of finding a solution that respected my dignity, you moved me to the garage and expected me to be grateful. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. In the background, I could hear Sasha's voice, high and agitated, though I couldn't make out the words. What do you want? He asked finally. What will it take to make this go away? What did I want? The question I'd been asking myself for weeks. Did I want the house back? Did I want an apology? Did I want them to understand what they'd done to me? Did I want my son back? The one who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers? I want you to understand that actions have consequences, I said. I want you to learn that love isn't a license to mistreat people. I want you to grow up and take responsibility for the choices you've made. But do you want the house back? He pressed. I looked around the community garden, at the other residents working together, sharing tools and knowledge and companionship, at Miss Chen teaching her granddaughter about growing things, at the simple pleasure of having dirt under my fingernails and purpose in my day. I want what I should have had all along, I said. Respect. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes do. David kept me informed of every development, every filing, every response from Marcus and Sasha's attorney. They were fighting the challenge, claiming that the transfer had been completely voluntary, and that my current actions proved I was vindictive and possibly unstable. Their strategy became clear as the case progressed. They were portraying me as an elderly woman who'd made a generous gift to help her struggling family, but who now regretted that decision and was trying to undo it out of spite. They painted themselves as young people, trying to build a life together, victimized by a bitter relative who couldn't accept that they needed space and independence. It was a compelling narrative, and if I hadn't lived through the reality of what had happened, I might have been convinced by it myself. They were good at presenting themselves as reasonable, caring people who'd done their best to accommodate a difficult situation, but they couldn't explain away the garage apartment. They couldn't justify making me live in substandard conditions while they enjoyed the comfort of the main house. They couldn't provide a reasonable explanation for why, if I was such a beloved family member, I'd been excluded from family meals and social gatherings. Most damaging of all, they couldn't explain Sasha's social media posts. Ashley had provided screenshots of dozens of posts that painted me as mentally unstable, hostile, and burdensome, posts that revealed the contempt Sasha had felt for me, even while she was pretending to care about my welfare. The deposition process was particularly revealing. Under oath, with lawyers asking pointed questions, the careful facade that Marcus and Sasha had constructed began to crumble. Details emerged that painted a picture of systematic exclusion and gradual marginalization. Sasha was forced to admit that she'd never asked my opinion about any of the changes she'd made to the house, that she'd moved my belongings without permission, that she'd never inquired about my comfort or satisfaction with the garage apartment, that she'd made social media posts questioning my mental capacity without any medical evidence to support those claims. Marcus was forced to acknowledge that he'd never stood up for me when Sasha made disparaging comments, that he'd never intervened when I was excluded from family activity, that he'd never asked if I was happy with the living arrangements, or if I needed anything to be more comfortable. Most tellingly, neither of them could explain why, if they truly cared about my welfare, they'd never once asked me how I felt about being moved to the garage. Not once had either of them checked to see if I was comfortable, if I had everything I needed, if there was anything they could do to make the situation better for me. Their indifference was documented, undeniable, and damning. As the legal battle progressed, word began to spread through our extended family and social circles. The story was too dramatic, too shocking to remain private. An elderly woman suing her own son for a house, claims of elder abuse, social media drama. It had all the elements of a story that people couldn't resist discussing. Some of the reactions surprised me. Relatives I'd barely spoken to in years reached out to offer support. Old friends emerged from the woodwork to share their own stories of difficult family situations. Neighbors from Maple Street, people I'd known for decades, began calling to tell me they'd always thought something wasn't right about how Marcus and Sasha were treating me. But there was also pushback. Some family members accused me of being vindictive, of destroying family unity over hurt feelings. A few suggested that I was too old to live alone, that Marcus and Sasha had been trying to help me by keeping me close, that I was being ungrateful for their care. These reactions stung, but they also clarified something important for me. The people who truly cared about my welfare were appalled by what had happened to me. The people who criticized my actions were more concerned with maintaining the appearance of family harmony than with addressing actual family dysfunction. It was a painful but necessary sorting process, separating the people who saw me as a person deserving of respect from those who saw me as a problem to be managed or ignored. The most difficult conversations were with Marcus himself. As the legal proceedings continued, he became increasingly desperate, calling at all hours, showing up at my apartment uninvited, begging me to drop the lawsuit and come home, to the garage, to the narrow bed, and the mini fridge, and the humiliation of being treated like an unwanted houseguest in my own former home. "Mom, please," he said during one particularly emotional phone call, "we can work this out. Sasha realizes she made mistakes. We both do. Just drop the lawsuit and we'll figure out a better arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. "I don't know. We'll make changes. We'll do better." "What specific changes, Marcus? What exactly are you proposing?" Silent, because he couldn't say it, couldn't offer me what I deserved because it would require him to stand up to Sasha, to prioritize my needs over her wants, to act like the son who'd once promised to take care of me when I got old. "I don't know," he repeated. "But we're family. We should be able to work this out. Family. the word that had been weaponized against me for months, used to justify behavior that no one would tolerate from strangers, used to guilt me into accepting mistreatment because blood relations supposedly excused everything. Marcus, I said gently, family doesn't treat each other the way you and Sasha treated me. Real love doesn't require the person being loved to disappear. The lawsuit continued through the fall and into winter. I spent those months building a new life, one choice at a time. I joined the book club that met in the community room of my apartment complex. I volunteered at the local animal shelter, walking dogs and socializing cats. I took a watercolor painting class at the senior center and discovered I had a talent I'd never known existed. Most importantly, I began to remember who I was when I wasn't defined by my relationship to Marcus, when I wasn't trying to be the perfect mother who never caused problems or made demands. I was Bertie Thompson, a woman with interests and opinions and valuable contributions to make to the world around me. The community garden became my special refuge. There was something healing about working with the soil, about nurturing growing things, about being part of a group of people who collaborated rather than competed. The other gardeners welcomed my experience and knowledge, and I found myself becoming something of an unofficial mentor to newer residents who wanted to try their hand at growing vegetables. It was in the garden that I met Walter, a widowed man in his 70s who'd moved to Willowbrook Gardens after his wife died. He was quiet and thoughtful, with gentle hands and a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard and made me laugh more than I had in years. Walter had heard about my legal situation through the apartment complex grapevine, but he never pressed me for details or offered unwanted advice. Instead, he simply accepted me as I was, treated me with the kind of casual respect that I'd forgotten was normal between decent human beings. We began spending time together, sharing coffee on my balcony in the mornings, working side by side in the garden, watching old movies in the community room on Friday night. It wasn't romance, exactly, but it was companionship, mutual respect, the pleasure of being seen and appreciated for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Walter's presence in my life highlighted just how isolated I'd become during those months at Maple Street. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have conversations where I wasn't walking on eggshells, where my opinions were welcomed rather than tolerated, where I could speak freely without worrying about causing offense or disrupting someone else's comfort. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the resolution of the lawsuit. David called me on a gray December morning with news I'd been both anticipating and dreading. "We won," he said simply. "The court found that the property transfer was invalid, due to undue influence and lack of independent counsel. Ownership of the house reverts to you, and Marcus and Sasha have 60 days to vacate the premises." I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, satisfied that justice had been served. Instead, I felt hollow, empty, like a warrior who'd won a battle but lost something precious in the process. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you," David said. "You can move back into the house, you can sell it, you can rent it to tenants. It's your property again, to do with as you see fit." My property, my house, the Victorian on Maple Street with its wraparound porch and rose bushes, with its memories of Jerome and the life we'd built together, with its ghosts of better times when family meant something different than it did now. But it was also the house where I'd been made to feel invisible, where I'd accepted crumbs and called them love, where I'd allowed myself to become so small that I'd almost disappeared entirely. Did I want it back? Did I want to return to those rooms that held so much history, both beautiful and painful? Did I want to try to reclaim a life that had been irreparably altered by everything that had happened? The questions followed me through the rest of that winter day, as I walked through my small apartment, as I sat on my balcony watching the bare trees sway in the cold wind, as I tried to imagine what came next. The phone rang again that evening. Marcus, as I'd known it would. "Mom," he said, and his voice was broken, defeated. "I heard about the court decision." "Yes," I said. "Sasha's gone," he continued. "She left this afternoon, said she couldn't handle the stress anymore, that this whole situation was toxic and she needed to protect her mental health." Sasha was gone, the woman who'd systematically pushed me out of my own home, who'd questioned my mental capacity on social media, who'd treated me like an inconvenient piece of furniture, had abandoned ship as soon as the consequences of her actions became real. I should have felt satisfied, but instead I felt sorry for Marcus. Sorry that he'd chosen someone who would leave him the moment things became difficult. Sorry that he'd sacrificed his relationship with his mother for someone who'd proven herself to be exactly as selfish and shallow as her behavior had suggested. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Are you going to make me leave?" he asked. "The house, I mean. Are you going to kick me out?" The question hung between us, loaded with decades of history, with love and disappointment, and choices that couldn't be undone. He was my son, the little boy I'd raised, the person I'd loved more than my own life. But he was also the man who'd watched me live in a garage and called it family accommodation. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need time to think." "How much time?" "I don't know that either, Marcus. I just know that I'm not ready to make any decisions about the house, about us, about any of it. I need space to figure out who I am now after everything that's happened." He was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it. I know I let you down." The apology I'd been waiting for, had needed to hear, had almost given up hope of receiving. It should have felt like victory, like vindication, like the first step toward reconciliation. Instead, it felt like the end of something. Not because I couldn't forgive him, but because I finally understood that forgiveness wasn't the same thing as going back, that loving someone didn't mean accepting whatever treatment they were willing to give you, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was to stop enabling someone's worst behavior by refusing to absorb the consequences of their choices. "I know you are," I said, "and I love you, but Marcus, I'm not the same person I was when I signed over that house. I'm not the same mother who would sacrifice anything to keep peace with her child. I can't go back to being that woman, even if it would make things easier for both of us." "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I'm going to live my life on my own terms now," I said. "And if there's going to be a place for you in that life, it's going to have to be on terms that respect who I am and what I deserve." I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the life I'd built from scratch, the life that belonged entirely to me. Outside my window, snow was beginning to fall, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new, and full of possibility. For the first time in months, I felt ready for whatever came next. Spring came early that year, and with it came decisions I could no longer postpone. The 60-day deadline for Marcus to vacate the house was approaching, and I still hadn't decided what I wanted to do with the property that had once been my sanctuary and had become the symbol of everything I'd lost and found again. I'd been avoiding Maple Street entirely since the court decision. Even driving past the neighborhood felt too complicated, too loaded with emotions I wasn't ready to process. But Patricia convinced me that I needed to see the house again, to walk through it, and remember what it had meant to me before everything went wrong. "You can't make a decision about something you're afraid to look at," she said over coffee one morning. "And honey, you've been through too much to let fear make your choices for you now." She was right, of course. I'd spent months running away from difficult situations, accepting what others decided was best for me, allowing fear of conflict to override my own needs and desires. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone who called the police when she was being mistreated, who filed lawsuits when her rights were violated, who built a new life from scratch when the old one became uninhabitable. I could certainly manage to walk through a house I'd once called home. Walter offered to come with me, and I was grateful for his quiet, steady presence as I drove toward Maple Street for the first time since I'd collected my belongings from the garage apartment. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled into the driveway, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could bring myself to get out of the car. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and somehow shabbier. The rose bushes I'd tended for decades were overgrown and neglected. The front porch where I'd spent so many peaceful mornings was cluttered with packages and newspapers that hadn't been brought inside. The paint was beginning to peel around the windows, and several of the shutters hung crooked. Marcus answered the door looking like he'd aged 5 years in the 6 months since I'd seen him. His hair was longer and unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion or grief or both. The sight of him sent a familiar pang through my chest, the old maternal instinct to fix whatever was wrong, to smooth over the rough edges, to make everything better. But I pushed that impulse down. Marcus was a grown man, and the consequences he was facing were the result of his own choices. I couldn't save him from them, and more importantly, I couldn't save him without sacrificing myself again. "Mom," he said, stepping aside to let us in. "Thank you for coming." The interior of the house was even more shocking than the exterior. The modern furniture that Sasha had insisted on was gone, probably taken when she fled. What remained was a bizarre mixture of my old things pulled out of storage and cheap replacements that looked like they'd come from a thrift store. The walls that had once been covered with family photos were bare except for a few lonely pictures hanging crooked in their frames. It looked like a house in the middle of being abandoned, which I supposed it was. "I've been trying to keep things up," Marcus said, following my gaze around the living room, "but without Sasha's income, and with the legal bills, it's been difficult." Sasha's income? I'd never known she had any significant income. Her social media influencer career had seemed more aspirational than profitable, and her wellness coaching business had appeared to consist mainly of posting inspirational quotes and selling overpriced supplements to her small following. "What kind of income did Sasha have?" I asked. Marcus looked embarrassed. "Her parents have been supporting her, supporting us, really. They were paying for a lot of our expenses, helping with the mortgage, that kind of thing. The mortgage on my house, the house I'd given them free and clear without any debt attached. Somehow in the 8 months they'd been living there, they'd managed to take out a mortgage against the property." "Marcus," I said carefully, "when I signed the house over to you, there was no mortgage. How did you end up with mortgage payments?" His face flushed red. "We needed money for renovations, for some of Sasha's business investments. The bank said it was no problem since the house was worth so much more than what we borrowed." Business investments. I walked through the house, seeing the evidence of those investments everywhere. The kitchen had been partially remodeled, with expensive granite countertops that didn't match the cabinets, and appliances that looked like they'd never been used. The master bathroom had been torn apart and left unfinished, with new tile covering only half the floor, and a vanity that was still in its packaging. They'd turned my house into a construction zone, borrowing money against its value to fund projects they'd never completed, and a lifestyle they couldn't afford. The equity I'd built over 40 years of careful payments had been mortgaged away in less than a year. "How much do you owe?" I asked. "About 80,000, Marcus said quietly, "maybe a little more with the interest and penalties." $80,000, against a house that had been free and clear when I'd given it to them. I felt Walter's hand on my elbow, steadying me as the full scope of what they'd done sank in. "The mortgage payments are about $1,200 a month, Marcus continued, "plus insurance and taxes and utilities. I can't keep up with it on my own." He was looking at me with that expression I remembered from his childhood, the hopeful, pleading look he'd get when he'd done something wrong, and was waiting for me to fix it. When he'd broken a neighbor's window with a baseball, and needed me to talk to the parent. When he'd failed a class in college, and needed me to call the professor. When he'd been arrested for drinking and driving, and needed me to post bail. For 43 years I'd been his safety net, his problem solver, his get-out-of-jail-free card. I'd always been there to absorb the consequences of his poor decisions, to smooth over the damage, to make everything right again. But not this time. This time, he was going to have to figure it out himself. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "It sounds like a difficult situation." He waited for me to offer to help, to suggest a solution, to take on his problem as my own. When I didn't, his expression grew more desperate. "Mom, I know I messed up, I know I treated you badly, but I'm your son. You can't just let me lose everything." Let him lose everything, as if his problems were somehow my responsibility, as if my failure to rescue him would be the cause of his difficulties, rather than the natural consequence of his own choices. "Marcus," I said gently, "you mortgaged away my house without asking me. You spent money you didn't have on things you didn't need. You chose a woman who abandoned you the moment things got difficult. These aren't problems that happened to you. These are problems you created. So you're just going to let me fail?" he asked, his voice rising. "You're going to watch me lose everything, and not lift a finger to help?" "I'm going to let you be an adult," I said. "I'm going to let you take responsibility for your own choices,
and figure out your own solution. We stood there in my old living room, surrounded by the wreckage of the life he'd tried to build, and I felt something shift between us. For the first time in his life, I was refusing to be his savior. For the first time in my life, I was letting him face the consequences of his actions, without rushing in to minimize the damage. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Walter and I finished our walk through the house in relative silence. Each room told the same story of projects started and abandoned, of money spent on superficial improvements while basic maintenance was ignored. The basement had water damage that looked recent. The upstairs bathroom had a ceiling stain that suggested a roof leak. The garage, where I'd been forced to live, still smelled of motor oil and contained boxes of my belongings that had never been properly sorted or stored. By the time we left, I knew what I was going to do with the house. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to punish Marcus, but because I finally understood that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to let them hit bottom. The next week, I put the house on the market. The real estate agent, a competent woman named Susan, who specialized in older homes, was optimistic about the selling price, despite the unfinished renovations and deferred maintenance. "Properties in this neighborhood are in high demand," she said as we walked through the rooms together, "and the bones of this house are solid. The right buyer will see the potential." The potential. That's what Jerome and I had seen when we'd bought the place 43 years ago. A house that could become a home, a place where we could build a life, raise a family, grow old together. We'd realized that potential, had filled those rooms with love and laughter, and ordinary daily life, but that chapter was over now. The house would need new owners, people who could see past the current chaos to what it could become again, people who would appreciate its history while making it their own. The listing went live on a Thursday, and by Saturday we had 3 offers. All of them were above asking price, which meant I'd be able to pay off the mortgage Marcus had taken against the property, and still have a substantial amount left over. I called Marcus to let him know about the offers, to give him a chance to prepare for what was coming. His response was what I'd expected, but had hoped to avoid. "You can't do this," he said, his voice tight with panic. "This is my home, our home. You can't just sell it out from under me. It's not your home anymore, Marcus. The court made that very clear, and I can't afford to keep a house I'm not living in, especially one with a mortgage I didn't agree to. I'll find a way to make the payments," he said desperately. "Give me more time."
Give me a chance to figure this out. How much more time? I asked. Another month? 6 months? A year? How long am I supposed to wait while you figure out how to pay a mortgage you never should have taken out in the first place? He didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. He'd been living beyond his means for months, supported by Sasha's parents and his own wishful thinking. Without that support, without a job that paid enough to cover the bills, without any realistic plan for changing his situation, more time wouldn't solve anything. "Mom, please," he said, and I could hear him crying. "I don't have anywhere else to go." The words hit me right in the heart. In that place where my love for him lived, where the memory of the little boy he'd once been would always reside. But I forced myself to remember the garage apartment, the mini fridge, the humiliation of being treated like a servant in my own home. I reminded myself that loving someone didn't mean enabling their destructive behavior, that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was to refuse to soften the landing. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You're smart and capable, and you'll find a way to land on your feet, but you're going to have to do it without using me as a safety net." I accepted the best offer, from a young couple with 2 small children who saw the house the way Jerome and I had seen it all those years ago, as a place with potential, a place where they could build something beautiful and lasting. The closing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, which gave Marcus time to find alternative housing and make arrangements for his belongings. Those 6 weeks were some of the most difficult of my life. Marcus called constantly, alternating between anger and pleading, between accusations that I was destroying our family and promises that he'd learned his lesson and would do better if I just gave him another chance. Other family members weighed in with their opinion. Some supported my decision, understanding that I'd been pushed too far and had every right to reclaim my property and my dignity. Others accused me of being heartless, of abandoning my own child in his time of need, of prioritizing money over family. The criticism hurt, but it also clarified something important for me. The people who thought I should continue to sacrifice for Marcus, who believed that my role as his mother superseded my rights as a human being, were the same people who'd been silent when I was being mistreated. They'd had nothing to say when I was living in a garage, but they had plenty to say when I stopped accepting unacceptable treatment. Their priorities told me everything I needed to know about whose opinions actually mattered. The most difficult conversation came 2 weeks before the closing. When Marcus showed up at my apartment unannounced, I almost didn't let him in, but Walter convinced me that I needed to face this conversation directly, to say what needed to be said without the buffer of phone calls or text messages. Marcus looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his clothes were wrinkled and ill-fitting, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. But more than that, he looked defeated in a way I'd never seen before. "I found an apartment," he said without preamble. "A studio across town. It's not much, but it's what I can afford." "That's good," I said. "I'm glad you found something. I wanted to talk to you before I move out. About us. About whether there's any chance we can fix this." I made coffee, and we sat at my small kitchen table, the same one where I'd shared so many meals with Patricia and Walter, where I'd planned my new life and made peace with my choices. Now Marcus sat across from me, looking lost and young despite being a grown man, and I felt the full weight of what had happened between us. "I love you," I said, "because that was the truth that underlay everything else. I will always love you. But I can't go back to the way things were." "I know I screwed up," he said. "I know I let Sasha treat you badly, and I know I should have stood up for you. I was trying to keep everyone happy, and I ended up hurting the person who mattered most." It was the closest he'd come to a real apology, to taking responsibility without making excuses or shifting blame. It was what I'd been waiting to hear for months, but hearing it now felt bittersweet rather than triumphant. "Why didn't you stand up for me?" I asked. "Really? What was it about keeping Sasha happy that was more important than treating your mother with respect?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like the answers might be floating there. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was scared she'd leave," he said. "After the divorce, after everything fell apart with Jennifer, I was so scared of being alone again. And Sasha was beautiful and exciting, and she made me feel like I was someone worth being with. I guess I thought if I could give her everything she wanted, if I could make her happy enough, she'd stay." "But she didn't stay," I pointed out gently. "No, she didn't. The moment things got difficult, the moment there were consequences for her behavior, she was gone. All that time I spent trying to keep her happy, sacrificing my relationship with you to avoid conflict with her, and she left anyway." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Clarity, understanding, the recognition that he'd made a terrible mistake, not just in how he'd treated me, but in the choices he'd made about what kind of person he wanted to be. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "I don't know how to undo the damage I've done." "You can't undo it, but you can learn from it. You can choose to be different going forward." "Will you give me a chance to be different?" he asked. "Will you let me try to earn back your trust?" I reached across the table and took his hand, the way I used to when he was small and scared and needed reassurance that everything would be all right. "I will always be your mother," I said, "but the relationship we have going forward is going to be different. It's going to be based on mutual respect, not just on my willingness to sacrifice for your comfort. It's going to require you to see me as a person with my own needs and feelings, not just as a resource to be used when convenient." "I can do that," he said eagerly. "I want to do that." "Can you?" I asked. "Can you really? Because it's going to mean sometimes choosing my needs over someone else's wants. It's going to mean standing up for me, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. It's going to mean treating me like family, instead of like help." He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wanted to believe he could be the son I deserved, but he wasn't sure he knew how. The pattern of taking me for granted, of assuming I'd always be there to absorb the consequences of his choices, was deeply ingrained. "It's going to take time," I said, and it's going to require you to prove it with actions. Not just words. I'm not going to accept promises anymore. I'm not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You're going to have to earn back my trust piece by piece. How do I do that? He asked. By being the man I raised you to be, I said. By treating people with kindness and respect, especially when it costs you something. By taking responsibility for your choices, without expecting other people to soften the consequence. By building a life you can be proud of instead of looking for shortcuts and safety nets. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the weight of the conversation. This was goodbye. Goodbye to the old dynamic where he was the child who could do no wrong and I was the mother who would fix everything. Goodbye to the illusion that family love meant accepting any treatment, because blood relations excused everything, but it was also hello to the possibility of a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and habit. Hello to the chance for him to become the man he was capable of being, if he was willing to do the work. I should go, he said, finally. Let you get back to your evening. I walked him to the door, and for a moment we just stood there looking at each other. He was my son, the baby I'd held and the child I'd raised, and the man I'd loved even when he disappointed me. But he was also a stranger in some ways, someone who'd made choices I didn't understand, someone who'd hurt me in ways I was still learning to forgive. Take care of yourself, I said. You too, Mom. He left and I closed the door behind him. Through the window I watched him walk to his car, his shoulders hunched against the spring evening chill. He looked small and alone, and every maternal instinct I possessed urged me to run after him, to offer money or shelter or absolution or whatever else might ease his pain. But I didn't, because sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to let them find their own way, even when it meant watching them struggle, because rescuing him now would only delay the lesson he needed to learn, would only enable him to continue making the same mistake. Because I finally understood that I was not responsible for managing his emotions, or minimizing his consequences, or ensuring his happiness at the expense of my own. The house sold without complications. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I chose not to attend. I didn't need to watch Marcus pack up his remaining belongings, or see the new family take possession of the place where Jerome and I had built our life together. Some endings were better observed from a distance. Instead, I spent that morning in the community garden with Walter, planting summer vegetables and planning the layout for the fall crops. We worked in comfortable silence, our hands dirty with soil, the sun warm on our back. Around us, other residents tended their plots, sharing tools and advice and the simple pleasure of growing things. This was my life now, small but complete, quiet but fulfilling, mine in a way that felt both precious and permanent. I had friends who valued my company, activities that brought me joy, a home that belonged entirely to me. I had learned to live for myself without becoming selfish, to set boundaries without becoming cruel, to choose my own happiness without sacrificing my capacity for love. My phone buzzed with a text from Susan, the real estate agent. Closing complete. Congratulations on your fresh start. Fresh start. Yes, that's exactly what this was. Not an ending but a beginning. Not a loss but a liberation. Not the destruction of a family, but the chance to build healthier relationships based on respect rather than obligation. I looked around the garden, at the neat rows of plants just beginning to emerge from the soil, at the promise of growth and abundance that lay ahead. Like those seedlings, I was starting over, putting down new roots in soil that would nourish rather than deplete me. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful. 6 months after the house sold, I received an unexpected phone call. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was sitting on my balcony with my second cup of coffee, watching Mrs. Chen's granddaughter practice riding her bicycle in the courtyard below. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. These days I was selective about which interruptions I allowed into my peaceful mornings, but something made me answer and I'm glad I did. Mrs. Thompson, This is Sarah Martinez. I'm a social worker with the county's Adult Protective Services Division. I was wondering if I could speak with you about your experience with our department. My heart skipped a beat. Had something happened to Marcus? Had he gotten into some kind of trouble that required intervention from social service? Despite everything that had passed between us, he was still my son, and the thought of him in serious difficulty sent a familiar spike of worry through my chest. Is this about my son? I asked. Oh no, nothing like that, Sarah said quickly. I'm actually calling because your case has become something of a teaching tool in our department. The way you advocated for yourself, the documentation you provided, the outcome you achieved. It's exactly the kind of self-advocacy we're trying to encourage in other clients. My case as a teaching tool, the idea that my experience living in a garage, being treated like household help by my own family, could somehow help other people in similar situations, had never occurred to me. But as Sarah explained further, I began to understand why it might be valuable. We see a lot of elder abuse cases, she continued, but most of them involve strangers or distant relatives. Family abuse, especially the subtle kind where adult children gradually take over their parents' lives and resources, is much harder to identify and address. Your willingness to call for help, to document what was happening, to pursue legal remedies, it shows other seniors that they have options. She asked if I'd be willing to speak at a training session for social workers, to share my story with professionals who might encounter similar situations. The idea terrified and intrigued me in equal measure. Standing up in front of a room full of strangers, talking about the most humiliating period of my life, admitting that I'd allowed myself to be treated so badly for so long. But then I thought about other women like me, other mothers who might be suffering in silence, accepting unacceptable treatment, because they'd forgotten they deserved better. If my story could help even one person recognize that they had options, that they didn't have to endure abuse just because it came from family members, then maybe it would be worth the discomfort. I'll think about it, I told Sarah, and that afternoon, I talked it over with Patricia and Walter during our usual walk around the neighborhood. We'd developed a routine of afternoon strolls, the three of us moving at a comfortable pace, while discussing everything from gardening tips, to current events, to the complex relationships we'd all navigated in our long lives. You should do it, Patricia said without hesitation. Think about how much you could have used someone like you when you were going through all that. Someone who'd been there, who understood what it felt like, who could tell you that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Walter nodded thoughtfully. It takes courage to share painful experiences with strangers, but it also takes courage to stay silent when you could help someone. You've already shown you have the first kind of courage. Maybe it's time to show the second kind too. Their support gave me the confidence I needed to call Sarah back and agree to speak at the training session. We scheduled it for the following month, which gave me time to prepare and to work through my own lingering emotions about everything that had happened. Preparing my presentation forced me to look back at that difficult period with fresh eyes, to see patterns and progression that I'd missed while I was living through it. I could trace the gradual erosion of my boundaries, the small compromises that had led to larger ones, the way I'd been trained to be grateful for less and less until I was grateful for a narrow bed in a garage. But I could also see my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity for growth and change. I could see the moment when I'd finally said enough, when I'd chosen my own dignity over family peace, when I'd remembered that I was a person worthy of respect and consideration. The training session was held in a conference room at the county building, with about 30 social workers in attendance. I'd expected to be nervous, but standing at the front of that room, looking out at faces that were genuinely interested in learning how to help people like me, I felt calm and purposeful. I told them about the gradual takeover of my house, about being moved to the garage apartment, about the isolation and humiliation I'd experienced. But I also told them about the resources that had helped me, about the importance of documenting abuse, about the legal options that existed for seniors in similar situations. Most importantly, I told them about the psychological barriers that kept people like me from seeking help. The shame of admitting that your own family was mistreating you, The fear of being seen as ungrateful or difficult, the belief that family love meant accepting whatever treatment you were given, the terror of being alone in the world without the protection of family, even when that family was the source of your suffering. The hardest part, I said, wasn't living in the garage, it wasn't being treated like a servant in my own home. The hardest part was admitting to myself that it was unacceptable, that I deserved better, that loving someone didn't mean I had to accept abuse from them. After my presentation, several of the social workers approached me with questions and comments. One young woman told me about a case she was working on that sounded remarkably similar to mine, an elderly man whose daughter and son-in-law had moved into his house and gradually taken control of his finances and living situation. He was reluctant to file a complaint because family is family, but she thought my perspective might help him see his situation more clearly. Would you be willing to talk to him? She asked. Not officially, just as someone who's been through something similar. That conversation led to another, and then another. Over the following months, I found myself becoming an informal advocate for other seniors who were experiencing family abuse. Sometimes it was as simple as listening to their stories and validating their experience. Other times it involved helping them understand their legal options, or connecting them with resources they didn't know existed. Each conversation reinforced my own understanding of what I'd been through, and why it had been so difficult to recognize and address. Family abuse was insidious precisely because it violated our most basic assumptions about love and loyalty. It was hard to see clearly when the people hurting you were the same people you'd spent your life caring for and protecting. But it also reinforced my conviction that speaking up had been the right choice, that protecting myself hadn't been selfish but necessary, that setting boundaries with family members wasn't cruel but healthy. My advocacy work led to an unexpected opportunity. The county was developing a new program for seniors experiencing family abuse, and they asked me to serve on the advisory committee. It was volunteer work, but it was meaningful work, the kind of contribution that made me feel useful and valued in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Through my involvement with the committee, I met other older adults who'd overcome significant challenges and rebuilt their lives after major setbacks. There was Margaret, who'd escaped an abusive marriage at 72, and was now running a support group for older women in similar situations. There was Robert, who'd lost his home to a financial scam perpetrated by his nephew, but had fought back and recovered most of his money through legal action. These people became my community, my chosen family of sorts. We understood each other's struggles without needing lengthy explanation. We celebrated each other's victories without jealousy or competition. We supported each other through setbacks without judgment or advice giving. It was during one of our committee meetings that I learned Marcus had been trying to contact me. Margaret mentioned that a young man had approached her after a community presentation I'd given, asking if she knew how to reach me. He'd said he was my son and that he had something important to tell me. I wasn't surprised that he'd been reluctant to call me direct. Our last conversation had been cordial but cautious, with both of us acknowledging that rebuilding our relationship would take time and effort from both sides. In the months since then, we'd exchanged a few brief text messages on holidays and birthdays, but neither of us had pushed for more substantial contact. I decided to call him, curiosity overriding my caution. When he answered, his voice sounded different somehow, calmer, more mature, less desperate than it had been during those difficult weeks around the house sale. "Mom, thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." "I always want to hear from you, Marcus. I may not always want to help solve your problems, but I always want to know how you're doing." He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in far too long. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, the not solving my problems part. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about taking responsibility for my own choices, and I wanted to tell you that you were right." He went on to explain that the months since losing the house had been the most difficult of his life, but also the most educational. Without the safety net of my financial support, without the option of falling back on family resources, he'd been forced to confront the reality of his situation and make some hard choices about his future. He'd taken a job with a landscaping company,
physical work that paid modestly but provided steady income and health insurance. He'd moved into a small efficiency apartment that he could afford on his own. He'd started attending a support group for people dealing with relationship issues and financial problems. Most importantly, he'd begun to understand the difference between love and enablement, between helping someone and hurting them, by preventing them from learning necessary lessons. "I used to think you were being cruel when you refused to bail me out," he said. "I thought you'd stopped loving me, that you cared more about punishing me than helping me, but I understand now that letting me fail was the most loving thing you could have done." Hearing him say those words, hearing the maturity and self-awareness in his voice, felt like a gift I hadn't dared to hope for. This was the son I'd always known he could be, the man I'd tried to raise him to become before life got complicated and relationships got tangled up in unhealthy patterns. "I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it completely. "It takes courage to face your mistakes and change your life. It takes strength to build something new, instead of looking for shortcuts back to what you had before. I learned it from you," he said. "Watching you leave that situation, watching you build a new life for yourself, watching you refuse to accept less than you deserve. You showed me what real strength looks like." We talked for over an hour, sharing updates about our lives, discussing his work and my advocacy activities, laughing about memories from his childhood that had been buried under years of recent conflict. It felt like talking to my son again, not the desperate man who'd mortgaged away my house, or the angry person who'd accused me of destroying our family, but the thoughtful, caring person I'd always known was in there somewhere. When we hung up, I felt something shift inside me, some tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying finally releasing. This was what healing looked like, not the absence of pain or the return to how things used to be, but the creation of something new and healthier from the ruins of what had been broken. A few weeks later, Marcus asked if he could visit me for dinner, not to ask for anything, not to try to convince me of anything, just to spend time together and continue rebuilding our relationship. I agreed, but with clear boundaries about what the visit would and wouldn't include. He arrived at my apartment on a Saturday evening, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine that he'd chosen carefully based on my preferences rather than his own. He complimented my home, asked thoughtful questions about my activities and friends, and listened genuinely when I told him about my advocacy work. Over dinner, which we prepared together in my small kitchen, he told me more about his new life. The simplicity of it, the way he'd learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and modest pleasures, the way he'd discovered that happiness didn't require luxury or status symbols, that contentment could be found in honest work and authentic relationships. "I'm dating someone new," he said toward the end of the evening. "Her name is Katie, and she's a teacher. She's kind and stable, and she thinks I'm a little crazy for giving up the house, but she respects that I'm trying to do the right thing. I'd like to meet her sometime," I said, and was surprised to discover I meant it. "When you're ready, when you think it's appropriate." "I'd like that too," he said, "but I want to make sure our relationship is in a good place first. I don't want to repeat the pattern of choosing a romantic partner over my family relationships. I want to be the kind of man who can love someone without sacrificing other important connections." As he prepared to leave that evening, we hugged for the first time in over a year. It was tentative at first, both of us uncertain about physical affection after so much emotional distance, but it felt real and honest in a way that our interactions hadn't felt in far too long. "Thank you," he said as he stood in my doorway, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself. Thank you for doing the work to become someone I can be proud of again," I replied. After he left, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, reflecting on how much had changed in the year since I'd first called the police about my living situation. I'd gone from feeling powerless and invisible to feeling strong and purposeful. I'd gone from accepting whatever treatment others were willing to give me to demanding the respect I deserved. I'd gone from defining myself entirely through my relationship with my son, to building an identity based on my own interests and values. Most importantly, I'd learned that it was possible to love someone while still protecting yourself from them, that setting boundaries wasn't cruel but necessary, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was to refuse to enable their worst impulses. My phone buzzed with a text from Walter. "Good dinner with Marcus." "Very good," I replied. "Thank you for encouraging me to give him another chance." "You earned that chance," he texted back. "Both of you did." Looking back now, I can see that everything that happened, all the pain and conflict and legal battles, led to something better than what we'd had before. Not easier necessarily, but healthy. Not without complications, but based on honest foundations, rather than unexamined assumptions. I'm not the same woman who signed over her house because she wanted to help her struggling son. I'm not the woman who accepted a garage apartment because she didn't want to cause family drama. I'm not the woman who ate leftovers in the kitchen while others laughed in the dining room. I'm Bertie Thompson, a woman who knows her worth and insists on being treated accordingly. A woman who builds her own life rather than living on the margins of someone else. A woman who loves deeply but not destructively, who gives generously but not self-sacrificially. And if my story can help other women remember their own worth, if it can encourage other families to build relationships based on respect rather than obligation, if it can show other people that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and demand better, then every difficult moment was worth it, because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to insist on being seen, being heard, being treated as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to stop accepting love that requires you to make yourself small. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.